Hello, welcome to the Community Builders Learning Call. I am joined today by Casper to Kuile. I'm going to try and describe you the best way I can, but then I'll hand over to you to describe yourself as well. But you, the co-author of the How We Gather report, co-host of the Harry Potter and the Sacred Text podcast, which I learned more about yesterday because we recorded a podcast together, but I'll let Casper describe that a bit better. And also he's interested in how we can learn from ancient religious tradition, about the emerging landscape and creating communities in this modern age. I'm going to hand over now to Casper. Maybe he can explain that to you a bit better.
Oh, that's a great introduction, Carlos. And hello, everyone. So nice to see you all. I see, actually, joyfully, a couple of people in Holland, which makes me very happy because my parents are Dutch. Just hello, iedereen. Nice to see you for those Dutch speakers. And lovely to meet you, Sasha. I've admired the community canvas, and this is so exciting to meet you and everyone else who's been connected to that project. It's just such a powerful tool, and I recommend it to people every day. So thank you to everyone who contributed and helped revisions. I know it was a real community effort, so it's beautiful. As Carlos was saying, my kind of two hats maybe for this conversation. One is a project called How We Gather, where we kind of mapped how secular organizations that were mostly run by millennials, this is kind of 4 years ago, so I'm always a little embarrassed to talk about it still, but it was looking at how secular communities were fulfilling the roles that traditionally religious communities would have done. So everything from obviously community, but also things like pastoral care, helping someone through a divorce or a diagnosis of disease, celebrating life moments, also kind of enabling creativity, holding people accountable, all the sorts of things that we would have expected in religious areas now being fulfilled by CrossFit gyms and maker spaces and online community of practice calls, all these interesting trends. And we were trying to see if perhaps this kind of new emerging landscape could actually learn with and from these ancient traditions. So that's one part of my work. And then a very kind of particular community that I'm involved with is a fan community in the Harry Potter world, where I run a podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text with my co-host Vanessa Zoltan and the rest of our team. And in that community, it's a sacred reading community. So these are folks who listen to the podcast and read the Harry Potter books and really turn to these texts as if they can teach us something about our own lives. So not just kind of a fan community, but really engaging with these texts in a more serious, disciplined way. So we have a podcast and we do live tours and live shows on tour and all sorts of interesting things like that. So I've enjoyed having kind of one meta-analysis project and then one very specific community where you have to figure out things like, okay, but how is this going to work financially? And what does that look like when we're all far away from each other? And we ran that as a local group for a year, and there's now 30 local groups around the world doing those in place as well. So anyway, enough about me.
Oh, that's great. No, thank you very much. At least we have a broader context. There's the managing and building a community around the podcast, and then there's also the research and work that you've done around existing communities and what that means in kind of the more secular communities, let's put it that way. So in terms of kind of an overview of the things that we thought we would cover during this webinar, initially I'd like to hear from Casper as well what community means to him, and so maybe get his thoughts, because this word community sorry, is I feel sometimes overused, and so the definition of it is, I would say, very useful in order to understand where Casper is coming from and some of the things that he's going to share with us. Understanding what the value is of being part of a community. I know personally from running the Happy Startup School, being able to, if you want to make the community, attract people to your community, how do you communicate that? And what do people get out of community? And what are the different ways that they can get value from being part of community? Another aspect I'd like to touch on, if possible, is this idea of money and meaning. There's energetically sustaining a community, making sure that people are all able to engage and there's activity there, but also how does that keep going? How do you keep a community sustaining itself? There's sometimes costs around that. And some people are trying to build sort of a livelihood around a community. What does that mean? And maybe sharing some ideas through that. We had this idea, I think we were talking a while ago about the idea of ritualizing the transaction. I'll leave it there for now. We might explore that in a bit more detail when we get to it. And so those are the kind of 4 broad areas that we might cover. I would be keen also to hear from you all as to what it is that you would be interested in getting out of this conversation. So please put something in the chat as something that you would like to hear us discuss or share or start a conversation on. If you could try and keep it as brief as possible so it's easy to read, and then Brooke and Lana will be able to maybe highlight any topics that we think that seem to resonate with people. Right, so let us kick off. Casper, tell us, what does community mean to you?
Well, it's always a beautiful question. And I should say that I grew up in a little village in England. My parents were Dutch, but I grew up in a little village in England called Forest Row, which had a very large Steiner school, or a Waldorf school. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Waldorf or Steiner education. Yeah, I see some thumbs up from Don and nodding heads. And so my experience of community is very much what I was raised with. My mother ran a bed and breakfast in our house. There were always people coming through our home, which of course as a child I resented deeply, but now I appreciate for what it taught me. And so I passionately believe, as you all do, in the importance and the power of community, but I'm also noticing how much that word is used at the moment. And how it doesn't always quite describe what I think it means. And so I've become very protective about this word community. And for me, it really boils down to these kind of 2 experiences of being deeply loved and deeply known. And that comes from Killian No, who runs a wonderful organization in Seattle called Recovery Cafe. And she talks about the way in which, it's very easy, whether through our kind of online profiles or whether through, engaging with social systems, that it's very easy to be known, right? People can know all sorts of things about you, but not really to feel that experience of love. But then on the other hand, also, where you have lots of relationships, you feel very connected in all sorts of ways, where you're very loved, but actually people don't really know what's going on with you. And that it feels like that has this kind of surface connection, this surface experience. And so a community for me is a place where those 2 things can really live together. And that's a high bar. So when I talk about community, that's the kind of community that I'm talking about. That is not to put any sort of value judgment on other types of connections, whether they're networks or maybe like neighborhoods or all sorts of other wonderful ways in which we're held together. But there's something about community that for me is special. And that is worth protecting. And I think my biggest fear is the way in which we're seeing some brands who are speaking to a cultural need, right? Like this moment is so clear that we're looking for more community, but there's a way of kind of using that language without backing it up. So that's something that I'm just always very conscious of. But yeah, to be known and to be loved, those are the things that I look out for. And there's also sort of little ways that you can tell, right? Like when people are together, do they cry, right? Either of joy or of sadness, but then it's real, right? Do people stay hanging around after the official thing has ended because they just want to be together? Or there's all these little indicators that you can just taste if a community really has that kind of depth.
Cool. So I think a number of us are running different types of communities. Maybe they're communities around learning, some things around connection. I know that Lana has different ways that she thinks of community or different types of community. You mentioned and that one of the key things I think is around connection. And you mentioned the thing about deeply loved, which I think for some people can feel a bit weird because, particularly with organizations, this whole idea of this very emotional aspect to connection that can maybe put some people off because it's a bit icky or less, I don't know, maybe that's just me. But I was in a conversation today about organizations and companies and trying to create connection there, but I think some people stray away from emotion because it's a bit harder to manage. I don't know. What was that? Actually, what the question is, how people responded when you've defined that, you've given your definition of community in that way?
Yeah, it's so interesting, especially when I think it often resonates with people on a human level. I think there's often discomfort when there's an assumption that that has to show up in the workplace, and I would agree with that. You know, I think there's real danger of making our companies or our work teams our core community. Again, I understand it's my life. It's definitely my colleagues are the kind of closest friends that I have, which is wonderful on the one hand, but also playing with fire, because in some ways you kind of want to have a little bit of a difference between you know, the place where you earn your income and frankly where, you know, you can lose your income, and the people who are going to kind of stand with you through thick and thin. I think there's a real challenge in having those things be the same, even though that describes my life right now. But generally, I think there's a longing for community in this moment. I mean, there's a real sense of, you know, we talk about isolation, we talk about disconnection, and this happens kind of over time, right? Where the institutions that held us in community, whether that was a physical place, or whether it was a religious congregation, or whether it was a guild, or whether it was a union, like a lot of those institutions are struggling to articulate their value in this moment, and we have to some extent rebelled them for good reason. You know, I'm gay, and so I'm the first to like point out all the flaws and failures of religious institutions, absolutely, especially ones that have been, you know, oppressive in so many ways to so many people. But now that we're all kind of individuals out there in the world and we're living, you know, our own life, we're now turning back and perhaps thinking, oh gosh, have we lost something along the way? And so I think that speaking of love and speaking of you know, those primal human experiences of belonging, actually do really resonate with people when you're trusted. And I think that's the key thing. As long as you are deemed safe and trustworthy, my experience is that people will eat up everything that you have to say about this stuff. I mean, like I spend, you know, I'll be in the studio later today talking about Harry Potter. Like, who would have thought that would be a place where people ended up talking about these kind of questions? But, you know, we've really, I don't want to say use that text to buy people's trust. That sounds very mechanistic. But by sharing an activity, sharing something that other people are invested in already, and frankly, we're already doing, right? People were turning to these books already when they had lost someone that they loved or they went through a breakup. When we affirmed that practice and kind of gave them a community with other people so that they could do it together and gave them some structure and tools, to read, you know, a book like Harry Potter as if it's a sacred text. It was amazing how much trust and openness there was to then talk about these bigger questions, which perhaps on the face of it, people would have rejected. So I think that there's something about being trustworthy before you can talk about those things, perhaps, that you're picking up on, Carlos.
Yeah. Okay. So there's for those of us who are, you know, running communities and looking to grow them, I would assume some of us, and looking to attract more people. You talk about there's a need for connection. There are people out there who want to be with other people and be seen, like you said, are deeply cared for. But another aspect is like that doesn't necessarily always make it easy for people to make a decision to be part of the community. And from your work with how we gather and looking at these other secular communities, you know, you talk about CrossFit and Soul Cycle as well as other communities. There are different ways of getting, or different levels of value within a community that attract people, but then also keep people. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that to give us some insight around that.
Yeah, I also see Brooke unmuting, which suggests there might be something wise to say there.
Oh, no, I was need to get there. We can discuss. I'll ask it another question soon.
Okay.
Yes. I just wanted to dive into something deeper, but thank you for noticing.
Oh, you bet. My life has now started to live on Zoom, so I'm like beady-eyed.
Yeah, impressed. Cool.
Well, Carlos was leading us to a really, I think for me, it's been a really key thing that I look for, which is this idea that there are different reasons why people join a community from why they stay. And this is something we've seen over and over again, especially with these fitness community, where People come for the body, but they stay for the community. At Soul Cycle, they talk about people come for the body, but they stay for the breakthrough. That sense of like having a moment on the bike where like suddenly you feel like you've reconnected with who you are and what matters to you. But if you were to say, hi, people, come join my community, everyone's very suspicious. But if you say, hi, people, let's work out together, it's like, okay, yeah, I know that's a valid thing. It's going to be good for my health. No one's going to think I'm weird to do it, right? Like it's a socially acceptable thing to say yes to. And often to like join a community just because you're joining a community feels kind of countercultural and weird. So we've talked a lot about those two layers of value. What's the thing that people say yes to initially? And then over time, as they build relationships, they realize they're actually staying for the people, not necessarily for the activity. And so there's a little bit of a sleight of hand there. And obviously you want to have a kind of both layers are valuable, right? Like, yes, it's good to be healthy and fit, and it's good to be in community. But I think communities that just offer that second layer, that just talk about community or the value of connection, they can really struggle, especially financially. We just don't value relationship financially in a way that we're willing to pay for it, which is absurd when it's actually where we get the most meaning. It's most impactful on our health and happiness. But that is the economy that we live in. So you kind of need to find something that people know that it's acceptable to pay for, whether it's a yoga class or they're learning a new skill or they're giving new opportunities. One community that I've really admired that does this very well is the Sanctuaries in DC. This is a community, they call themselves a diverse arts community with soul. And it's the final case study in how we gather. And they work especially to bring two very different groups of people together and offer those two levels of the value. On the one hand, it's people who are moving into DC, mostly young urban professionals, people who have a lot of opportunity, but not a lot of community, mostly white. And then a lot of people who live in DC, who've grown up there, who have a lot of community, but not a lot of opportunity, and are mostly folks of color. And so then kind of what they do is they bring people together to collaborate across different artistic lines of difference. So a poet and a painter, or a hip hop artist and an Indian classical musician. And they bring those people into collaboration to create art together, which they then give a platform for. So whether it's time in the recording studio or a gallery art space or an event where they can perform live, they've really found that way of offering two levels of value, which appeal to those two different groups. So it's just something that I keep in mind when I look at communities. I'm like, okay, what are the different levels of value that they're offering?
Right. Thank you, Casper. Given that topic, did any thoughts or questions come up for anyone that they'd like to share? Don.
Just interesting. Lana suggested I do a survey out to my audience about, and not label it community or coursework. I teach courses, and so I put it, would you like to have videos and content, or would you like to have more interaction with people? And I found it quite interesting. On Facebook, out of 90 people that responded, I got 60 that wanted more video, better videos and content, and only 30 that wanted, community. And then in my community, which is small, I got 10 respondents, but it was 50-50. And so part of it is that I think I've been a pioneer all my life. I started Herbs 50 years ago. People don't know what community is. You know what I mean? It's like, it's hard to tell people, yeah, do this because it's really cool, but they don't have a clue what it is. So I'm only learning what it is. I mean, it's like I just started seriously the community in January, moved my course into my networks like this place here. So I just want to bring that up for what you were saying. And thanks. That I'm trying to move to the place where I am recruiting, and I know that I'm not going to get people come for the relationship. They're not going to pay for it, but they'll keep coming for the herbs. So thanks. That was a piece of information I needed this morning. So thank you.
Well, Don, what you just said is so resonant for me as well, because we found that with a lot of the leaders of these communities that we started to map and get to know, very, very often the leaders themselves had had an experience of community, often in a religious context. And there's data for this in the Jewish world, that most of the kind of Jewish innovators were the products of the best of the summer camps and the synagogues and the federation programming, all sorts of like healthy, strong experience of communities. And then they were able to translate it, even though it looked very different, but they had that feeling of what it was like. And what you just said is so true. It's like a lot of us just don't even know what that feeling is of being truly known and truly loved, right? Like that just is kind of absent in our lives, like hopefully in our families, but not even guaranteed to be there. So there is a way in which we are all having to relearn what it takes to be in community. And frankly, sometimes it's really uncomfortable. Like, this is the thing that we should always be very clear about. Community is also terrible, right? Like, it's people are allowed to like ask things from you and you have to say yes now and then. They can just like show up in your life. Like, there's all sorts of ways in which the way that we are in the world, which is like, I get to choose things on my timetable. I get to choose what I want. Like, I'm it's a very learning to be in community, and that just takes time. And I'm with you. I'm learning just as much as anyone else. So
I think I'm gonna, I won't say much more, but I'm gonna try to, as I learn more, I mean, what I'm realizing that when we were on with Sasha, I said, well, they've got all this research for offline communities and how healthy it is. And so he gave the spectrum of being alone and being in an offline community. And I was saying, well, it's the same for online communities. He said, well, you can at least move over to here and you're not over here by yourself. And so I appreciate that. But I'm also learning how to, when I'm in my community, be there more. Like, even in my mindset, like I do, like you, I live on Zoom, and I'm realizing we're in the field together, we're in real time together. So it's not as good as being in the room together, but it's better than, I'm with you guys from the Netherlands and from all over the world. So what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to then put that into I'm trying to teach people how to be on online communities, because it's all of us know this is a strange new world.
Well, and the data, when you look at how it impacts health, there is actually very little difference between people being surrounded by rich relationships and people feeling like they're being surrounded by rich relationships. So it's our emotional experience of social connection that is as big an indicator for health as actually the social connections. So, and that plays the other way around, right? You can be surrounded by people and not feel really connected and be just as lonely as someone who's super socially isolated structurally. So I love what you're pointing to. I think it's really important.
Thanks, Tom. Peter.
Yeah, there were two things that you touched on there, Casper. Maybe you could talk about the role or the function of conflict within building a community, and or struggle, or however you want to phrase it, and then also generosity, I think you mentioned as well, as maybe the opposite of that consumptive mindset.
Thanks, Peter.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, thanks, Peter. I would highly recommend reading Scott Peck, if you haven't yet, just on conflict and community. He has these great 4 stages that a community goes through. I don't want to say things that you're already familiar with, but it's a really helpful model, mostly for yourself as a community builder, to feel okay when it feels like everything is falling apart because there's conflict. He talks about the first stage being pseudo community, that everyone is nice and pleasant to each other and people are there and it's friendly and it's nice. And you could look at it and be like, hey, we're in community. But actually everyone's avoiding conflict. And as soon as something gets pushed or it's unavoidable, there is total chaos. Right? Like, the normal systems break down, people don't know how to interact, everyone else thinks people are being rude, or it just feels awful and everyone wants to run away. And frankly, often they do, right? A lot of communities fall apart. Among the ones that we've studied since, the 4 or 5 years that we've been doing this, there are a lot of communities that started and then have fallen away because of sexual assault in the community, because of founder burnout, because of financial trouble. Like, all the things that happen in any place when humans are together, sadly, are true in these communities also. So you have that chaos period. And then the fourth one, I think the third one he calls emptiness. Like, that feeling that whoever's stayed, everyone is just kind of like, there's a wilderness period, essentially, where the conflict itself has maybe died down, but now there's just this kind of sense of nothing. And out of that, he says, in the fourth stage, you can really get to community, because it's only when we've survived and like lived through conflict effectively together that we can really trust one another, that that it's going to be okay, because turns out when humans are together, there's conflict. So you better get ready. One of my favorite tools to engage conflict specifically is a practice called covenant. And this is, again, something we've borrowed from the religious world. Of course, within the kind of Jewish and the Christian religious traditions, covenant was something that was, if you remember Noah's Ark, right, when the floods came and Noah kind of kept the animals alive, and at the end, when the flood is, the water goes away, God sends a rainbow. And the rainbow is the sign of the covenant between people and God, and that God will no longer drown the people, which, climate change we can talk about. But nonetheless, so this is a practice called covenant. And essentially, it's kind of like what you would do when you bring people together and you ask everyone to say, how should we treat each other? Like how do we want to respect each other? And you kind of lay those ground rules. That's something familiar to most of you, I'm sure. Well, covenant is simply taking those ground rules, writing them up in a way that's a little more beautiful, maybe like a manifesto, right? And then to read them out loud at the beginning of every meeting, and to spend time, we spend maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes in our team meetings doing this, talking about how have we lived into this covenant and where have we fallen short. And it is the most helpful, it creates a container for the conflict to happen safely, because it no longer is severely disruptive to say, actually, Marianne, I really had an ouch moment when this happened, or, Faisal, when you did this, I felt that. Like, if you don't have a place where people can say that, it's super disruptive and scary to bring it up. But if you make a container for it every time, some weeks no one's going to have anything, fine. But other weeks there's going to be something that's come up, and you have a safe place and a process with which to engage it. And also you have a chance to celebrate, like, hey, we really did well when we had that difficult moment, like, or I want to celebrate so-and-so because they really helped me with this. So it's a beautiful way of establishing a culture in which you can handle conflict with safety. So I can send out a resource that we put together for a specific project. So Carlos, maybe if you can just note that down and remind me, and we can send that out to everyone. But it's really been a wonderful project, and it's a way of deepening relationship over time. So what Don was talking about as well is like, this gives a container in which people can kind of share more safely over time. So that's some stuff on conflict. Yeah, generosity. I mean, you wouldn't be here if you weren't generous. So I don't feel like I have anything to teach you all on this. Like, there's no logical reason that we're doing this, right? Like, it is hard work and not always rewarded. So I think the thing to say on generosity is maybe ensure that as you are leading others, that you yourself have a place where you're led. That you have a place that fills your well. And frankly, that should be outside of the community that you lead. It needs to be a place where you can show up and not be responsible in any way. So whether that's, like going to, it can be anything. For me, like one thing that's been really important for me is getting a massage frequently. I notice that so much gets in my body, and like just to have someone like, just like lovingly touch my body and like work away all the knots. I like nearly always cry on the massage table because I'm like, oh, now I realize this insight that I didn't realize until now. So whatever it is for you, like just something where really you're not in charge and you're not responsible is highly recommended. So you can be more generous when you're showing up in your place, because our communities are not the place to fulfill our needs, right? As leaders of a community, we're there to serve the community.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I had a short follow-up question, if that's okay.
That's fine, yeah.
So I love the 4 phases of conflict. I don't know if you're familiar with Susan Whelan's work on teams, but it's the 4 phases of it's exactly the same model, which is really funny. It's way more focused on the corporate world though. But so I'm part of a startup community here, and we recently faced the possibility that the building we're in might be repurposed. And all of a sudden, what we noticed is we shifted from being a co-working space to a community. And that makes me wonder, is it an idea? And if it is, how do you actually artificially generate conflict so that you can create that initial sense of bond and connection within a community? So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
That's a great question. So I was just sharing with Sasha and Carlos before everyone joined. For the last 3 years, I've lived with 28 freshmen students. I live in the middle of Harvard Yard. I'm in a dorm room right now we've painted and made it as nice as possible, but it is still a dorm room. And it's been so interesting to live with 28 freshmen who are in this kind of weird experiment, right? For a year together, people they don't know, sleeping next to each other, literally, you can't get more kind of intimate than that. And it's so different every year. And it depends on what happens. So last year was a horrible thing that happened, but one of my students, her older brother, took his own life. He was a senior student and committed suicide. And that happened in October. And the community that was formed last year was so strong, even though these kids had very little in common. There was this inciting incident that brought people together because they realized they needed each other, right? Because here they could see that someone like them in complete distress because their loved one has died, and realizing, oh my God, that could happen to me. Oh my God, what actually matters to me? What am I going to invest in? How am I going to treat people? Like, that was so front and center. This year, different group of kids, nothing really happened. Like, tiny minuscule community, despite my weekly efforts to like bring people together over food and movie night and like all this stuff, right? Not happening because they didn't need each other, because basically they found community elsewhere on campus. And for some of them, right, others didn't and were super lonely all year. So I don't know how much you can orchestrate that. Maybe you have to be like Littlefinger in Game of Thrones and like really make things happen. I don't know. But to me, it's really about how can you respond when it does happen, and then really, you know, like we brought them together just to sit with candles, and someone brought a guitar, and they, you know, then they start sharing, and it's about how do you respond to the moments, because I think people really react badly against those forced community things, right? Like, turn to the person next to you and share something you've never shared before. I'm like, get me out of here. Like, this is not for me. So I think it's about being ready to jump on the moments when there is distress or when there is conflict, and then that trustful people are in. I don't know if that helps.
And I think another thing you said that resonates with, you know, if you can't create that conflict in that moment, it's having that manifesto and that covenant in a community that if there isn't there is eventually going to be some conflict, but it's like, hey, how can we gather around this manifesto consistently? Because that's how we're going to show up to each other. And to me, that builds such trust and unity. And it doesn't feel as coerced and forced. It feels almost in a way comforting because it's some consistent way the community knows how to interact with each other. So I really love that.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead if you want to.
Well, I was just going to say, Brooke, one thing that you're reminding me of is that it's super important that people contribute to making that covenant, right?
Yes.
Like that there's a stake that we have in what we've created, which is frankly frustrating because every time there's new people, you kind of have to do it again, you know, at least semi-regularly. So that it doesn't just become this kind of ossified mission statement that's on the front door of an organization and we never feel like it was ours. So you're just reminding me of that it's really, to feel that connection, you kind of have to contribute. I love Margaret Wheatley's work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her writing, but she has these great 10 principles for community, I think. And the first one is people care about what they help to create. And I just always remember that.
Yeah, Peter Block talks a lot about that too. I think, you know, I'm thinking of an organization with 500, 5,000. It's, you know, you can have the core group. And then I think if that same manifesto isn't going to be able to be changed with every group, it's saying, what does that look like for us? And how do you want to create that today with each other?
Right.
Like, how do you want to contribute to this coming to life? And what does that look like for you? Do you have any other suggestions when it is an organization of 500 people to 2,000 that you want to have that common?
Yeah. Well,
and also diverse, you know.
Right. And that's the thing. I'm obsessed with small groups. I think we all know the power of small groups. And obviously within religious context, you have people who do Bible study together, or you have people who gather to do prayer, whatever it is. They're so effective because they give that small container where there is more intimacy. So Brooke, as you're speaking, I'm thinking immediately of, okay, what if at the organizational level, there's maybe some principles, and then at the small group or at the team level, we create like our own kind of team covenant around how we're going to put those principles in action in our work together. Because it would allow for that diversity of context and of the actual work that we're doing. But again, you want, if there's a connection to that kind of the vertical of the umbrella, I think that could be really effective. Yeah.
One question, if you want to share it, I think it could interest others about, creating a community around your podcast. From what I heard, you had one, and now you have like 40 home groups that talk about it. Is that true?
Yeah.
So maybe just a little bit of that process, how you discovered the people to lead it, and then, whatever you think would be important to share.
This is mostly an example of what not to do, and it happening anyway, which is so my friend Vanessa wrote her thesis. She grew up in an atheist Jewish home, and she always says, for her family, that God died in the concentration camps, like very fiercely atheistic family, but still very, very kind of proud of their Jewish heritage. And so when she came to divinity school, she was like, I don't want to read the Torah. I'm going to read Jane Eyre as a sacred text, classic kind of book from English literature. And so she was running a little small group, and I came along one week and I was like, this is very cool, but let's do it with a book that people actually read. So we started the Harry Potter and the sacred text group. And immediately a lot of people were coming along. And what we do in these groups is to kind of translate ancient reading practices from Jewish and Christian tradition, but doing it with the Harry Potter books rather than the Bible or the Torah. And what was really interesting, we ran this in-person community for 9 months every week, 7 to 8:30 p.m., have some snacks, do sacred reading in a whole group and then little pairs, and then kind of celebrate our time. And Vanessa especially really took on the role as a chaplain. She visited people who ended up in hospital, people met, they started dating, best friends met, like all the things that you expect to see in a community. And we knew that to make this financially sustainable, people had to give about $10 a time. The average donation was like $4.50. And so it was like, this is just not going to work. But we kept hearing from people around the country saying, hey, can we do that group here, blah, blah, blah. And we thought maybe we could turn this into a podcast. And so when we started it as a podcast, we said, okay, we'll do book one, chapter by chapter. And if it works out, great, we'll continue. If we're able to make a living from it, essentially. And we were very lucky that we got onto the front page of iTunes. And so we had this kind of explosion in listeners. And so that was extremely lucky. But what happened as the podcast started growing, and we have about 65, 70,000 listeners to every episode now. So it's grown to a healthy size. People were calling their sister on a Sunday night being like, hey, let's talk about the episode. Or teachers were adapting the resources and using it in the classroom. And then some people started getting together, and then they heard that there'd been a group here in Cambridge, and they were like, oh, can you send us, like, what do you do in a group? And so by the time we started paying attention, we looked around and we were like, oh my God, people have already set up like 10 of these groups. We should help them. And so we started to kind of upload some resources, and this is how you can do it, and introduce people to each other. And then we hired the woman who ran the group in Chicago and said, you know best, like please work for us part-time and support all of these local groups. So she's now kind of weaving together all these different group leaders, and they have a Zoom call like this to share tips. And so I guess the takeaway from that story is like, look at what people are already doing and help them do it better. That has been just a huge part of, I think, of our success is just paying attention to how people are already behaving, and then help them do it better. That's very vague, I know, but.
Cool. Anyone else have any questions around what's been discussed so far? Don.
It's probably not quite been discussed this far, but I want take on it is what I find in my community is time seems to be so precious, especially for this kind of synchronous thing. And so I'm looking now, like there's sort of 80 members in my community because it was just based on students and mentees, people that are mentoring with me, but I want to open it up to more public, partly for the mass, because I know that I did my thesis on online learning when I did my master's degree about 4 years ago. And I learned that that's one of the biggest challenges with online courses, getting people to complete, but then getting people to show up. So I'm kind of in this headset where I want to get the mass, because I know out of that mass, I'll only get 20% like this here, like I don't know how many people Carlos has, but only this many people. I know we're a particularly group, and we have this advantage in Mighty Networks to create groups within that mass. So that's kind of great. So I guess I'm just, I'm trying to say, having been a face-to-face teacher most of my life, where 100% of my students showed up 100% of the time because it was in real life, to then go down to like 20% of showing up maybe, and then there's also those people that are lurking that aren't necessarily participating. So that's, I don't know, that's something that eats away at me is this. I mean, just adjusting to it and saying, okay, well, the reality is I'm only going to get this much, so I got to aim for a bigger amount. To then, I don't know. That's my that's on my heart.
Flake culture is like the disease that we all live in. It is so frustrating. I feel you. A few things. One of the biggest takeaways that I had from studying with Marshall Gantz, who is a wonderful community organizing professor here at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And he said something that's just really stuck with me. And he said, we always try and make engagement easy. We shouldn't make it easy. We should make it meaningful. And that has just always stayed in my head, because I think a lot of the times we're trying to lower barriers. We're trying to improve access. We want to make things kind of, just a click away. And in all sorts of ways, that makes sense, right? We don't want to exclude people because they can't access something. But on the other hand, there is something about designing threshold moments or building in an experience of meaning so that this action actually helps identify who I am, and it says something about what I believe in and what I stand for and who I care about. That we kind of don't want this to fall into that consumer mindset, as Peter was saying. And so that's an invitation I just offer, which is just to think about, okay, is there a way that we can build in some ritual? Is there a way that we can build in reflection whereby people are more consciously connecting whatever I'm asking them to do with the sense of who they are?
I would also suggest you guys to stop now. We'll take longer.
That's just not...
Great. Was that for me?
I'm assuming Lana's talking
I think
about
that was for her kids.
Okay. Well, those kids have got a great mom, so I appreciate you, Lana. So the other thing that I would say, and this is actually a great segue, the communities that were most intense about accountability were the best at holding a group together. And frankly, always it was the community. In the religious world, there's a real hesitancy about being kind of strict about accountability for good reason, right? Those centuries of marginalization and oppression, and we don't want to say to people that you can't participate because you're this person or you've done that thing. But in the fitness groups, they had all of these things like right on the whiteboard what your goal is for this month. And so it's visible to the whole community. So you feel like, okay, I really am going to do 30 pull-ups by the end of this month because I made that public goal. And when you reach your goal, it's publicly celebrated, right? Like there's clapping, there's all sorts of enthusiasm. And for some of the communities, the November Project being one of them, which is a free fitness community in the US, where people gather like 3 or 2 times a week at like 6:30 a.m. and do all this crazy stuff. They offer an enthusiasm stick every week for the person who's really carried the community. But they are also unafraid on their website to call out people who said they were going to come and then didn't show up. They will literally post a picture of your face saying, Anna, we missed you. You gave a verbal commitment, and guess who was standing in the rain at 6:30 outside your apartment? So it's really a tool of shame, which is an intense tool to use. But I think that's the only way that we start building a culture that counters this flakiness is when people realize that there are there's impacts of you saying one thing and doing another. Again, Recovery Cafe that I mentioned before in Seattle, the way they frame it is not that it's about you being bad or lazy or whatever, but it's we need you. Like if you're not here, we actually can't learn what we need to learn because we need your voice in this circle. And the more you can help people realize that, like what Brooke was saying about co-creating, a team agreement, like thinking about how to build ritual into it. Like when people are like, they just don't think they matter. And so not showing up isn't going to impact anyone. And actually, you're sitting there looking at the room or even virtually being like, hey, we're really missing Rosalind and Ty, like, where are they? And so little things like getting, obviously following up with them individually, but the most powerful tool is to get the community to follow up with each other. That's what happens at CrossFit. It isn't the coach who reaches out. It's the other members of the community saying, hey, we really missed you today. Where were you? So it's that feeling of being needed and being valued that I think are the best kind of counteractions to that.
I just wanted to say one thing. Oh, sorry. Very quickly, because I actually went to a bunch of the November project things here too. They're not as intense as the group that you're mentioning. I haven't gotten shamed, but I just wanted to say that the shame thing is interesting because to me it's also maybe less shame, but it's more of an accountability thing, right?
Totally.
In a way. And so, and I feel like I've heard this more and more often, where people are like, oh yeah, my accountability partner, and this, and so it's like a real thing. I feel like, as you say,
yes,
part of the accountability is also feeling like you're needed, and you belong there, and so that's a really powerful thing.
And you can design for that in some sense, right? So if for example, people aren't able to complete the project that they've been set without working with a partner, a very simple way of kind of building that into their community design. Shame is when it goes bad, right? We don't want to ever use shame, but accountability is when it goes right. But it has consequences. I think that's the thing with accountability. Like you need to know what the consequences are if you don't do it.
More push-ups.
Exactly.
Excellent. The thing I like I relate it when you're talking about that to your two rules about community or two elements of community. You're seen. You're being seen when you're able to be picked out and say, actually, we missed you. Where were you? Does anyone else have any questions? I'm conscious we have a few minutes left, and so I just wanted to give some space for any thoughts that have come up, or even just comments from your own experience or work that you're trying to do.
I do. What do you think? I'm just curious. How many communities do you think one person can truly be connected to?
Oh, Brooke, that's a great question. It's hard. It's really hard to really be anchored in more than one or two. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, we're coming up against this kind of consumptive mindset that we have where it's like, on Tuesdays I'm at this place and Saturdays I'm here and blah, blah, blah. But to really build something with people, you have to be in. So, and I don't want to say that one is bad or one is good. I think it depends on your season of life. If you have young kids, my God, right? Like it's amazing you're showing up anywhere, frankly. I agree. Right? So it's not, but if you're really going to be in on something and help other people feel that you're there, I think we have to be conscious about where what the limits are to that. So I don't want to put a definite number on it, but I think it's a question we should ask ourselves. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Yeah, I have young kids too, but I don't see possible being more than 3, sometimes 2. I know you've got your work community, friend community, family community, but religious community, that's when I think people feel stretched, burnout, and they're kind of there, but not there. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Well, and this kind of touches on something that Don had mentioned as well around time. The word parenting is a new word in the last 30 years. Like no one used that word until recently. And the amount of time that we consciously parent our kids now has like doubled in the last 50 years or something. The amount of time and attention that we're with a child. And so trying to find ways to build community around things that people already do, rather than being like, here's an entirely new offering, which you're also going to be late for, it is I think a really good strategy. So like, I think about preschools, like they could be amazing hubs of community if they had more capacity and resources, frankly. But like people are already showing up there, the kids are doing something. Imagine if the parents could just like sit around the table and do some watercolor painting and talk about their feelings. That place would be full. And so like building your kind of community offering around a place where people already go or a thing they're already doing is I think a smart way to tack on rather than offering a whole new thing, which just feels overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to look for who's going to be jumping on that business idea.
Well, I have a friend who did like drink and draw events, like get-togethers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
that's fun.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, it's a way of like infusing something that's like good, drinking, with something that's a little more meaningful, right? And like it facilitates conversation, which is hopefully a little more interesting.
Oh, great.
I want to maybe get back to accountability and hold everyone who's here accountable, especially those who haven't said anything. Maybe it'd be lovely to hear from you.
But Sasha, here's rule number one about accountability.
Yes.
Here's rule number one about accountability. We can only hold people accountable to what they have said for themselves. So if someone came onto this call saying they wanted to talk, then you should use this moment.
Absolutely. But I feel like it is in the name. It's a learning call, and we are a community. So if you're not here, if you're just here to lurk, that doesn't
Sasha
count.
just wants to shame some people, I think.
I was going to say, or how about we frame it like we want to hear from you because we need to hear your voice to learn from you.
Exactly. I wasn't finished. Thank you for making what I started even better. So anybody?
Okay, I'll go first. I think that I'm not saying much because I learn a lot by listening. But it's just being here, it's amazing. And listen to Casper and all these people that are trying to change and make new communities or already engage the ones they have. It's so difficult to do that. It's so hard to make people understand how they need each other and to be there for each other. So I'm trying to build a new community for teenagers, and maybe from early ages they can feel that communities are important and they can learn from each other and they can be there for each other. So thank you, Casper and Sasha and Brooke and Carlos, for giving us this moment to learn.
Thank you, Larissa. Wow, building community for teenagers. God bless you.
I know. I ask myself the same question every day. Should I do that?
The answer is yes.
Very good. Hendrik.
Yeah, just to add some comment, I think throughout this conversation, I feel like when we discuss about community, especially when it comes to the in between money and meaning, it like a coin, with two-sided. One side we should think about the community, but the other side is coming like a product or service. What I'm thinking is like maybe Harley Davidson. I think they're not really selling motorcycle, but actually they're selling a very very exclusive community of high profile people, and motorcycle, the expensive one, is the most representative for that kind of community. So it's like combining two sides between tangible and intangible. The community always intangible. That's why when we discuss about intangible things, it's like a never-ending discussion because it's intangible anyway. But when we can tangibilize the intangible into a product or something like a motorcycle, and maybe I think service also, like Carlos doing the summer camp and so on. I think that's should be something that represent or projecting what community who we are, but in tangible way. I think that's what I have in mind along the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. We have one more. Does anyone feel that they'd like to contribute? Maria.
There, okay. I just unmuted. I've been listening with considerable interest. It seems to me that if you're doing a community around an activity or an interest, it's very different from doing a community around a much deeper need. So, I mean, when I work with sensitive people, maybe I'm fortunate, but they have a deep need to resolve a lot of issues related to their lives. So they want to show up. And if you can find some kind of a deeper need that makes people want to show up, you don't have to worry about all the shaming. You don't have to worry about all the accountability. They're not going to fight with you about the manifesto because you've already put that deep need into your manifesto. So I personally believe in making it as easy as possible in some ways, but I agree with the insight about making it meaningful. I think that's very, very important. And if you can do that, then I think the relationships will grow over time. Right. Because then I think people have, because you can't get love and known right off the bat.
Absolutely.
So if you have something deeply meaningful that people want to show up for, you're really, it's almost like you're creating a space for the capacity for people to know each other and love each other, but you have to create the space for it first. Right. And that's one of the things, you know, talking about time, there isn't space. If you look at any relationship, you can tell, is the space there for what needs to happen or not? So you really have to be creating the space, and by creating something around something that's deeply meaningful to people, then I think you have the chance to reach that high bar of creating an environment where people feel deeply loved and deeply known. That's my thoughts.
Oh, that's beautiful, Maya. I've got to just offer one thing. There's a wonderful minister in Indianapolis called Mike Mather, who has a great book, and he talks about that folks who are poor or at the margins of society feel like they have nothing to give, but lots of needs. And then folks who have wealth or have lots of privilege feel like they have lots to give, but they don't have any needs. Right? Like, even though they do, but like we've just been told that we don't need one another, or we don't need places like the ones that you're describing. So I love that kind of a modality that you've offered us of like, hey, are we dealing with folks who know that they need something, or are we dealing with folks who actually don't know that they need something even though they do? And then designing differently for that. That's really smart. I love that. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, Carlos, back to you.
No, that's interesting. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure we could talk for longer, but I'm conscious of Casper's time, but also everyone else. You may have places to go. Before we leave, Casper, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us? This is your shameless promotion time.
Oh, I have a lovely little newsletter. If you're interested in that, I'll type it in the chat box. But mostly, I just want to say huge thanks to each of you for what you're doing. I know how much it takes, and I know how tireless it is. And it's so important that you have this place to be with one another. I'm so grateful for all of you for showing up and for sharing with one another, because this is the most important thing, I think, in the world right now. Like, in community, there's a great quote, like, whatever the problem, community is the answer, right? And that's what you're all doing. So great, like, deep bow of thanks. And I so appreciate your time today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Casper. And maybe everyone unmute yourselves and say goodbye.
Bye. Thank you all.
Hey, and thanks so much.
Excellent. And see you on the next call.
Okay.
In case, well, we also have notes as well for people who too late. We should mention that. So we've typed up some stuff and all the resources and links, so we'll share that. And then
we have everyone's email addresses, so we can email them too, as well as share.
Excellent. All right.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Catch you later. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.